I'm going to take you through another wonderful attacking game by Boris Spassky, the 10th world champion. This was recommended to me by one of my regular viewers on the channel, and I'm very happy to oblige. It's also been a favourite of mine for a long time. And, well, here we go. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us on Patreon or via PayPal. Links below. So here we go. Spassky against Polugaevsky played in the Soviet Championship in January 1961. Spassky was, 23, just a few days before his 24th birthday, so a pretty young competitor in the Soviet Championship. He actually came equal 5th, so didn't win, but did pretty well. It's a Queen's Indian. And regular so far, Polugaevsky plays bishop e7 and decides he wants to exchange off a lot of pieces with knight e4. Now, this could easily lead to simplifications very quickly. Spassky exchanged on e4, and if he wants to play for a draw, he can do this and just trade lots of pieces. But instead, after exchanging on e4, he played bishop f4. So that's already a signal that he wants to play this game. He wants to get more than a draw. Polugaevsky castled, bishop d3. And here, well, you could just exchange on d3. f5 was played by Tony Miles much later on. But Polugaevsky plays a bishop b4 check, which is kind of an understandable move because it displaces White's king. So, for example, you can't block here because of bishop takes bishop. So Spassky plays king f1. So, okay, understandable why Black played this check. But actually, the one problem is that Black loses time with his bishop because, of course, it's not the best square and White always threatens to trap it. So bishop takes bishop, check, queen takes bishop. And now, Black has to watch out for c5 and a3. So therefore, the bishop comes back. So Polugaevsky is hoping that White loses a bit of time with the king. And here is where Spassky starts to rev up. He plays h4. So what's the big idea? Well, of course, he's looking to play knight g5 and checkmate on h7. Not a bad idea. So Polugaevsky decides, okay, I want to close off that diagonal. Looks reasonable and looks a little bit like a Dutch now. King e2, good move. Connecting the rooks, I like that. d6 from Polugaevsky, looking perhaps to put the knight on d7 and maybe push forward with e5. And now g4. So Spassky really starts to go for it now, opening up the G file. I was keen to look at this game because it's a wonderful game and wonderful strategy by White. But also it's a little reminder to those of you that think that AlphaZero invented the concept of advancing the H-pawn and the G-pawn. Players have been doing this for a long time, I can tell you, and this game shows that. So what's the idea? Well, if pawn takes pawn, then knight g5 threatens mate on h7. The queen. Whoops, misfire. Hang on, that was also a misfire. Queen takes pawn. And if bishop takes knight, then pawn takes bishop, still threatens mate. And after g6, queen e4 attacks the rook, attacks the pawn. My goodness, I can't fire with the arrows properly today. And that is already winning for White. So after g4, Polu played knight d7. And Spassky swept the rook across to g1. And his intent is clear. He wants to attack on the g-file. Now, Polu was a bit obliging here. He took on g4. But already he's under a lot of pressure. Pawn takes pawn, rook takes g4. Knight f6, attack the rook. Now, if the rook comes back to g2, then knight h5 is a bit annoying. So rook g5 was played to prevent knight h5. Good idea. Queen d7, and now the h-pawn advanced. Now wants to go the whole way. It's cramping these two pawns. Knight e8 attacks the rook, so the rook came back to g2. And now Polugaevsky desperately needs counterplay because white is just going to barrel down the g-file. So he played b5. So this is basically just trying to distract white on the queen side. If this is taken, then you can imagine, maybe a6 or rook b8 and then a6. So Spassky just keeps it closed, or as close as he possibly can, with c5. So this was taken. And now Spassky carries on with h6. Now there's a couple of nice variations. If g6, if black tries to keep it closed with g6, then of course we take. And this is already completely winning. Knight e5 attacks the queen. Queen d5, and then rook g1. And knight f7 and queen g8 follows. Okay, another move. Let's just have a look at c4. This is beautiful. We've got queen takes pawn check. Pawn takes pawn, discover check on the h-file. King goes back, we take. Black takes back, and this is actually forced mate. The king is driven up the board. Well, let's just go the whole way. This reminds me of some of the problems that I've been setting on the community tab, and mate follows shortly. So back to h6. So black is obviously in trouble because there's no obvious way or no good way to actually close the g-file. So rook f5. So he's hoping that after this, the white pawn will block the g-file, but bishop e5, c4, queen e4, that's okay, nothing has changed. Queen d5, and now the queen comes over to the g-file. So Spassky would very much like to take with the piece and then checkmate down the g-file. c3. So now Polugaevsky's really trying to shake things up, trying to get some counterattack here. But Spassky shuts that with b3. b4. That again tries to get the queen to counterattack white's king. e4. Attacking the queen and the rook. Queen b5 check, and now the king steps up the board. The rook comes back to f7. So that means that if bishop takes, then knight takes, and the g-file remains closed. So pawn takes pawn on g7. So the g-file is closed, but don't forget there's an h-file here as well, and that is significant. Knight f6 from Polugaevsky guards h7. So first of all, we eliminate the knight. And now rook takes h7. So if king takes, then, well, mate in a couple of moves. So Polugaevsky, last desperate try, he gives up his rook. If queen takes, then bishop g5 is actually winning for black. So Spassky has to play king takes, and now it just needs a few delicate steps with the king. Queen d3, the king comes up the board. Bishop d6 check. King g5. Okay, there's still going to be mate on the h-file, but king takes rook. And now Spassky is just a couple of steps from triumph. If he had played king f6, then this is winning. Queen d4 check, king f7, and there is no decent defense to checkmate on the h-file. You can see queen takes mate. Absolutely nothing to do. Wonderful king walk. Unfortunately, instead of king f6, Spassky played king h5. He must have been in terrible time pressure. You can imagine it, because these variations are really not simple to calculate. He would have had to have seen way ahead in advance, so he'd obviously used up a lot of his time. He played king h5. And after queen b5 check, in fact, if Spassky plays e5, this should lead to a draw. Black has enough to draw this game. It's still very, very complicated. But king h4 was played. And in this position, queen g5 rescues black. In fact, it does a bit more than rescue black, because now white doesn't have anything better than to go into this endgame. And with this protected passed pawn on c3, then white is obviously struggling. King g4 would still give white decent drawing chances, but Spassky played f4. This is before move 40, where I assume the time control was. So this is inaccurate. And we'll see why in a second, because after rook takes c7, rook takes pawn. This is the problem. White is in desperate trouble. This is actually winning for black now. Here's a little illustration of why. I should say Spassky played king g4 now in this position. But if rook takes a7, c2, the rook has to go behind. And now check. And rook c3. That's why it would have been better to bring up the king instead of playing f4. So this should be winning for black. King g4. Let's just go through the final moves of the game. e5. a3. Black now just cleans up. a5 protects that pawn. That's very important. King g6. Watch out for checkmate. So the king checks away. Rook checks away. And now king h7. And if king takes pawn, rook takes g7. g8 was played. King takes e5. Rook g1. And now the rook comes round and takes the b pawn. That was the final move of the game. Basically, once the rook takes the pawn, it's all over with these connected passed pawns. A tragedy. It was an absolutely beautiful game by Spassky. I love the concept of playing h4 followed by g4. It's one of those occasions where, again, Spassky, he doesn't mind wandering around with his king in the middle of the board. And yeah, if he'd played the right move here, that would have just crowned an absolutely wonderful game. But tragically, king h5 was a mistake. Wonderful stuff, but I hope you enjoyed that. And again, it shows Spassky's wonderful instinct for the attack. Thanks for watching.